Alright, now we've come to the easy part of the tutorial, which is taking everything from the previous chapters, all of our objects that we've created, and everything that we worked on, and bringing it all and putting it in one scene to make our nice little blizzard or simple snowfall scene. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and pull out a sidebar over here so we have a nice preview, and I'm going to load in a plane. So we're going to go to our Objects tab and go to our second from last button here and add in our plane. I'm going to go ahead and drop that object right away and then just lift it up just a tiny bit so it's not quite in the our infinite ground plane, just so we can see it a little bit better. And now what I want to do is go to our middle tab up here for our measuring, and we're going to go ahead and size it up. I'm going to change our size on the X to 1500 and on the Y to 1500. And of course, since it is a plane, there is no z-axis, so we can leave that at 0. Alright, so now the next thing I want to do is go ahead and create a new layer. So in the bottom right hand corner of the screen, we're going to click that new layer button, and we can go ahead and change that if we want to. Change its name to just snow will be fine. We're going to take our plane and drag it down into that new layer. And this will give us the ability now to hide this if we want to, or lock it in place so that we're not editing it. So I'm going to go now and add our ecosystem to this plane. So I'm going to go up to our first tab up here and go to our material editor. Right mouse click on the material and go to edit material. I'm going to turn off cast shadows and receive shadows, and that way our cylinders aren't casting any shadows in the scene. And I'm going to turn this to an ecosystem. We go to the general tab to add in our cylinder objects. We're going to click add object, and we're going to select our snow cylinder for animation because it's much taller and it'll be a lot easier to animate our scene if it's already in there. I'm going to change our scale to 0.7, which should be good, and density we're going to leave at 50%. We could bring it down a little bit farther if we wanted to, and we will just a little bit later when we're actually doing our animation of the snow, which is going to be covered in the next chapter. But now we want to go to our scaling orientation, and just so that our levels for the tops of our cylinders aren't so up and down, we want to change this to 0.4. And that way we have a little bit of size variation, but not too much. Go ahead and just click populate and click OK. And we can zoom our camera out a bit here and take a look at our scene. And we should be able to see our snowfall. All of our snow is showing up in our preview, which we see. Now the next thing I want to do is hide the snow from the scene, because we're pretty much done with it for right now until we go ahead and start animating it, which is going to involve actually cloning and copying this object and changing it a little bit. But I need to hide this from the render right now because it does take a long time to render snow. So if we click down here, you see this little eye on our layer. If we click on it once, what it'll do is lock our layer. Now, if we're not selected, let's say we have the sunlight selected, we can try clicking in our scene, and we can sort of see our ecosystem for the snow, but we can't click on it and we can't edit it. If we want to edit it, then we have to actually click on the object within the layer panel. So that's a nice little feature we have there, just to kind of get it out of the way for right now. But I'm going to click on it one more time, so that way we don't see it at all. So if I click on that sunlight, now we don't see that object at all in the scene. But it does still show up in our render, and that is going to slow down our render times, especially if we're trying to preview what we want to make in the scene. So I'm going to right mouse click on that plane and click hide from render. Select our sunlight again, and now it's just like there's nothing in the scene. Now before I load in our procedural terrain, I want to change our background or our sky and atmosphere. So I'm going to go to Atmosphere tab and Load Atmosphere, or you could hit F5 on the keyboard, which is a much easier way. And I'm just going to select that same sky we've been using for our snow scenes, our previous ones. Just give that nice dreary look of a winter day. And I want to go and actually go into the Atmosphere Editor now and add some fog into our scene. So go to our Atmosphere Editor or click F4, and now we're just going to up our fog not too much, but watching our preview render just to see how much is showing up in the scene. And go ahead and click OK. And we can also see that preview within our camera view. We can see that little bit of fog up until the horizon. So now we can go ahead and add our terrain. So we're going to go up here to our terrain tab, our terrain button. We're going to go to the middle button, one with a little F next to it, and that F stands for function because it's a procedural terrain. Go ahead and click on that, and now we want to edit the size. So we'll go to our size tab just like we did before, and we're going to make it the exact same size as our snow, our snow plane. So we can change that to 1500 on the X and 1500 on the Y. Now another thing too is we also need to edit our Z, because we're not just working with a two-dimensional object anymore. We need to scale it up on every single level. So we're going to bring our Z-axis up to 200. And I'm going to just zoom out here. And as we can see, our terrain is a little bumpy. And it might be a bit much for a snow kind of effect. And although we are going to have a material on it, that procedural is still producing that large bumpy effect. So since we are going to be using mostly our bump map from the material to create the speckled look for the snow, I need to edit our terrain. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on it. And the first thing I want to do is turn off the zero edges, which is an option that's only available for the procedural terrains, or at least in this way, where it actually takes it from that mountain look and flattens it out all the way. And now we need to actually edit the function so that we can smooth it out and make it look a lot more like snow. So we're going to right mouse click on our altitude production preview, making sure that we're in the procedural tab, which is our last tab, and right mouse click and go to edit function. Now we can select our simple fractal node. Our default that we have on here will work fine, unless you want to go into specifics and create something a little nicer looking. I'm just going to go with something basic right now. And I'm going to bring our roughness down to 0.4 or 0.41. And that's pretty much the only adjustment we need to make. And click OK. And see how it's smoothed out our terrain quite a bit. And we can go ahead and bring our scale down. And just bring that down to 0.7, which should be okay. And that should be all we need to do. So we'll just click OK. And we want to hit the drop object. And it's going to tell us there's nothing to drop onto. So that means we're at our lowest point, and that we're not below the ground plane, and we are above it. So I can just move our camera out. And what I want to do now is sort of look for a place to place our cabin. And I'm just going to go ahead and zoom our camera out quite a bit. And maybe I'll just go ahead and rotate this around on the other side. And we'll just zoom in here. And what I'm mostly looking to do is put our peaks in sort of the background, so it's covering up our terrain. And I also want to be around in the corner of the terrain, and that way there's a lot more in the scene without having to add too much geometry in the terrain and still get a nice looking effect. And I'm going to go ahead and click off our procedural terrain right now. So now we can get a different option for moving around, and we have more of a pan and tilt view instead of actually rotating around the object, which would make it a lot easier to sort of place our camera. We're going to want to go down far enough to where we can actually see that terrain, and then bring it up just a little. And that looks like it should be good. So now we want to go ahead and just edit our material. So making sure our procedural terrain is selected, we want to click on our first tab up here, which is our material tab. And then right mouse click and go to edit material. Okay, now we're actually going to be loading in one of our preset materials as we did before for our snow. So we're just going to go ahead and double click on that preview we have over here. We're going to select our gray clumps, which is located under rocks, and click OK. And now it's going to ask us if we would like to preserve the altitude of our terrain. and we're going to click yes, because we don't have to change the position over again. And now all we need to do is make a few subtle changes. Change our color to white, and then under reflections, we're going to up that to about 9, and then blur it just a little. We can click OK. And now we should have a pretty nice looking snow effect here. Now, because of where the sun is, we have this very high light on our terrain. So I'm just going to go ahead and move it around rather than moving the actual light itself, just so that we don't have to worry about that too much. And we can see a little bit better bump in there. And that looks pretty good. We can use this spot for our scene. And we'll just get a nice little preview render here. And we still have some nice white areas, but that's going to happen in real life because snow is highly reflective. So now what I want to do is load in our cabin. And we want to make sure we load in our cabin before we go ahead and create our ecosystem for our procedural terrain, because that way we can use some of the powerful features where we can avoid creating copies of the ecosystem in the cabin. And that way we have a nice area around it that's kind of with cut down trees. So we're going to go up to File and Load Object, and we're going to load in that cabin we worked on earlier. Click OK. And now we're going to need to zoom out and place it within our camera field of view, which you can see by these gray dotted lines. It'll give us a better idea of where the camera's at. We can just move it nice and close to the camera. And now we want to go ahead and drop that down. Another thing we also need to do is scale it down because it's quite large. So we're going to need to just pull that bottom handle, or that top handle, and just scale it down until it looks about right. And might even still be a little big for our scene. So we'll scale it down just a little bit further. So it looks like right about, maybe about 20%, 15% where we were before of its original size. We'll just pull that up. So it's somewhat in the snow because the cabin, since it's in a blizzard, is going to be mostly covered in snow. And maybe we'll bring that just a little bit closer to the camera. We just want to position it because we don't want it too far in the snow, but enough so that we're covering up sort of the flat areas at the bottom so they're not sticking out. We're just watching the preview window to see exactly where we're at, because since it's selected, it's a little difficult to tell where it's at. So maybe we'll just bring it up a little bit more, watch our preview, and that should be good. So now we can go ahead and load in our ecosystem, our trees. So we want to select our procedural terrain, and we're going to double click on our preview surface so we can bring up our material editor, and we're going to go to our ecosystem tab, go to general, and we're going to add object. And now we can grab one of the trees we made earlier, and it's really your preference what kind you would like. You could have several different types in there if you wanted to, but I'm going to go ahead and select this first one and click OK. And just so we can get a size idea, I'm going to bring it down to 0.5 and just click populate, just to see how big our trees are and if we need to make any major adjustments. So let those load in, and it looks like our trees are going to be a little big. So I want to bring those down. I'm going to go to our density tab and actually lower our density down to a rather low amount because we're just looking at scale right now. So it's going to be much quicker to produce a lower or a small density amount so that we don't have so many polygons in the scene just as we're looking at our size. Just let that load in there. it's populating our ecosystem right now. And even though our density is low, our scale is kind of small, so it will take a little bit longer to produce that amount of trees. And they look like they're actually a little small now. So maybe 0.4 and populate that. And as you can see, it's going much quicker now because it doesn't have nearly as many to make. And even now they look kind of small. I think the main reason before was that we had a tree directly in front of the camera. So what I'm going to do is actually boost that up to 0.7, and I'm going to click OK for right now and not hit populate. But what I'm going to do is add another object to the scene, an invisible object, which will affect our trees that are going to be populated around our camera. And that way we don't have any trees blocking our field of view. So just want to zoom out and find our camera just by following our gray lines. We can see our camera is right there. And what I want to do is place a object directly underneath it. So what I'm going to do is just grab a sphere and scale it down. And then we want to bring it below the camera. And if it's below the camera, we shouldn't see any shadows from it at all. Of course, you can make it transparent if you wanted to, and that way you definitely won't see it. But right now, I don't think we'll have a problem with it getting in the way because it's right below the camera, and the way our lighting is set up, we shouldn't see any shadows. So we can go back to our procedural terrain, double click on our surface, and now we're going to hit populate and take a look and see what happens. And now, actually, around 0.7, it looks like we have about the right size of trees. Maybe we can make them a little bit bigger, maybe 0.9, and see how that looks. Now we have some nice large pine trees in the scene. If we can go to our density, we're going to up that to 35%, hit populate. And that might not be quite enough yet. I also want to use our decay near foreign objects, which we already have on, but because of maybe the scale of the trees, we might need to edit that. I'm going to hit populate one more time at that higher density level and see if we need to expand or decrease that value. And that looks like it actually should be okay. A nice amount of trees over in that area, and what we can do if we want to really see what's going on, we can move our top view over by our camera, and we can kind of see how that decay is happening. And the decay actually might be a bit much because we're losing a lot of trees over here. So I'm going to bring down that influence to 2% and hit populate, and keep looking at our top view, and we can see if any more trees are created, and we can see that they are. So now we still have some in front of the cabin. You could, of course, raise up your camera view looking down if you wanted to. So I could go ahead and just bring up our camera and make it so our camera is looking down on the cabin. And just move that into position. And now we still have that tree right in front of there. So we want to make some more adjustments to that ecosystem. Bring down our density just a little, and we'll up our influence to 3 or 4. We'll just go ahead and type in a value of 4. And hit populate. And we're still looking at the overall effect because we are, of course, going to be changing our trees and adding another one. So yeah, now it's looking pretty good. We have a nice outcrop here, but I'm going to go and add another tree. So I'm going to go to Add Object and add that other snow tree we made, which is the more heavily covered one. And change our scale down to 0.8. And we want its presence to be just as much as the other one. But this will add a lot more variation to the scene. And like I said before too, you could add all different types of trees. If you modeled more than 2, use them, and you'll get a much more realistic looking effect. Also, if you want to have different types of trees, like we made the simple dead tree with no leaves on it, and not the pine tree that looks pretty neat, and we could use that for the scene as well. Alright, so now I'm going to click OK. And we want to turn on our snow now and take a look. I'm going to turn off hide from render. And we might as well just display that in here. And we'll watch our preview render now, and we can see our snow coming down. And now you can see it's only showing up in certain parts, but we'll of course take care of that in our next chapter, where we're going to show you how to animate it and why we have the density so low. So that'll take care of anything you're wondering about as far as why we kept the density low and why there's gaps in there. But there is one other thing before we get on to the animation portion, and that is the overall rendering. If you want to take a look at our atmosphere editor, the best way to get a really nice look with any scene is to use our radiosity or illumination. Even global ambience can add a lot more to the scene. I prefer using global illumination because it uses a fairly quick render time, but not, and still pretty much the look of a radiosity, at least close to it. And with global illumination, it's pretty much the best way to go if you want a quick render, because if you're not looking to sit around for several hours for each frame, it's definitely the way to go, because radiosity can take a long time, especially if you have lots of trees in the scene, and of course we have lots of snow in this scene, so that can take a long time. Another thing too is our snow animation. What we're going to be using is motion blur. So with any animation, motion blur looks best. So if you want to set that, what we can do is just double click on our camera, and we can change our motion blur length. 50% is the default, and that will work fine for snow. And if you want to render that, we can right mouse click on our render tab up here, and we're going to have to go to broadcast in order to enable our motion blurring. Or you can go to your user settings and check off and on what it is that you want. So now we're going to go on to animating our snow.